The implicit association test is a good example of that. That's the test that's being used to assess people's unconscious biases, unconscious racial biases. And so, for example, if I showed you a bunch of pictures of black people and a bunch of photographs of white people, and then I asked you to associate a good or a bad word with the black people or the white people to respond after you've seen the picture. If you are white and you saw white photos, you'd be faster at responding to the positive words. And so they've used that as evidence of racism. But part of the problem with that is that you can't distinguish it from a novelty response. So, I mean, most people in a given racial group are far more familiar with members of their racial group. And the fact that they're more likely to associate negative things with racial groups that are outside of their racial group isn't something that can be easily distinguished from just a novelty effect. But they make wide-ranging claims about the inbuilt biases in people, and also, and that's lent impetus to these movements that are racing through corporations across the United States and governmental agencies, where people are being subjected to mandatory unconscious racial bias retraining. And there's no evidence, by the way, that that works at all. In fact, the evidence that there is suggests quite the contrary.
I saw this on one of your videos. You were discussing how preposterous this is on one of your videos, because one of the people that was opposing you was actually a part of something like this, right?
Yeah, well, the human resources and equity people at the University of Toronto have made mandatory unconscious racism training, anti-bias training, and they've made it mandatory for their staff. And I found that absolutely appalling. First of all, it's political re-education. This is one of the things that really makes me proud of my country. Our government has now announced that the judiciary in Canada will be selected. If you're going to be a candidate to be a judge, you have to produce a dossier that specifies your identities, whatever they happen to be, racial, ethnic, religious. And then the committee that's going to appoint you to the judiciary has to have undergone mandatory anti-racism and bias training before they're allowed to serve on the committee. So basically, we've set up a situation in Canada where the people who select our judges have to go a kind of indoctrination that has no validity from a scientific perspective before they're allowed to select our judges.
Now, who's enforcing this? Where did this come from?
The Justice Minister. But the Federal Justice Minister.
Where did this program come from?
Oh, like, there's all sorts of people who are offering these programs now. And so it's become a growth industry.
But what is their qualifications? That's a good question, right? None.
Qualifications.
Zero.
Yeah,
huh? Yeah. The eyebrows are raised.
Yeah, well, there's no way of having qualifications for doing this sort of thing, because it's not a valid procedure.
So how do
people
they
who claim to be qualified?
So they claim to be qualified. They come to the university and they say, I have a solution. The university says, finally, just run with it. And
That's
they just
exactly
implement it, because to question anything that would absolve racism is racist.
Yes, right. Yes, and they did that in collaboration with the Black Liberation Collective, which
Explain that one, because that one's adorable. The Black Liberation Collective, isn't that the group that somehow thinks that white people are inferior because they don't have enough melanin?
Yeah,
so they
it was
don't
started by a woman who said exactly that. She's a black supremacist, and she said that the reason that white people are inferior is because they don't have enough melanin in their skin. And melanin apparently is this agent. It's a pigment, but it's apparently this agent that transforms cosmic energy into wisdom. I mean, she's completely. You can make up your own mind about her. And then the other person who started the Black Liberation Collective is a woman who used to work for the University of Toronto Students' Union, who is now being pursued by that students' union for embezzling $300,000 from that organization with the help of a couple of her cronies.
Well, why let a few facts stand in the way of abolishing racism?
Yeah, well, they also are perfectly willing to promote violent means of social transformation, and the university claims that it's in favor of safety. Because they've gone after me because my refusal to use compelled pronouns has apparently made the campus unsafe. But they're perfectly willing to take advice from the Black Liberation Collective, and not only are they willing to take advice from them and not disavow them despite their support for violent means of social revolution, they're also pushing equality of outcome on their employees. And the people who taught their mandatory anti-racism and anti-bias training program said outright in their training material, which I have copies of, that any institution that doesn't have equality of outcome as part of its characteristic at every level of the power organization is corrupt and should be restructured. But that pales in comparison to my refusal to use compelled pronouns, obviously.
Don't understand how this gets so far. I just don't understand how no one has, there's no rational thinking involved in the administration and the people that are implementing these ideas. I just don't understand how it gets to the point where...
Well, things get to terrible places one tiny step at a time. You know, if I encroach on you and I'm sophisticated about it, I'm going to encroach 2 millimeters. I'm going to encroach right to the point where you start to protest. Then I'm going to stop. Then I'm going to wait. Then you're going to calm down. Then I'm going to encroach again right to the point where you protest. Then I'm going to stop. Then I'm going to wait. And I'm just going to do that forever. And before you know it, you're going to be back 3 miles from where you started, and you'll have done it one step at a time. And then you'll go, oh, how'd I get here? And the answer was, well, I pushed you a little farther than you should have gone, and you agreed. And so then I pushed you a little farther than you should have gone again, and you agreed. And if anybody's interested in this sort of process, and this is a horrifying book, if you want to read about how this process works, you can read a book called Ordinary Men by Robert Browning. And Ordinary Men is about, Browning was interested in how the Nazis trained how they trained people to kill, basically. And so Robert Browning studied this police battalion. It's a very interesting book. So these were middle-aged German men. So they were raised and educated really before Hitler came to power. So they weren't indoctrinated Nazis. They were policemen. And when the Nazis went through Poland and then needed to impose their brand of order on Poland, they brought policemen in. They brought this battalion of middle-aged policemen in. And their commandant, their commander, was by all accounts a pretty decent guy, and he told them that because it was wartime they were probably going to have to do some pretty terrible things, but that they could go home if they didn't think they were up to it. So there was no compulsion. You know, this wasn't a Milgram experiment or an experiment where you had to obey orders. The guy who was giving the orders said, look, this is going to be awful, but you can back off. But the guys thought, well, I'm not going to leave my comrades here to do the dirty work, you know, which is kind of a virtue in a perverse way. And then Browning details how they went from ordinary policemen to guys who were taking naked pregnant women out into the middle of fields and shooting them in the back of the head. And they were physically ill during most of the transformation process. You know, they started out by rounding up the Jewish men between the ages of 16 and 65. Well, you know, you can kind of understand that because you're at war. And then, well, then they put them in stadiums. And then, well, then they had to shoot some of them. And then they had to load them on cattle cars. It was like one step at a time. These guys were having a dreadful time of it. They didn't stop. They didn't stop.